Hello and welcome back to Alpha Finance, where money mindset meets financial knowledge. So today we're going to be reacting to a video from CNBC called "What is Keeping Middle Class Salaries Low?" Obviously, I have my own opinions on that, but we're going to keep an open mind and then we'll react to whatever's in the video. So let's go ahead and play the video.
Between 1979 to 2024, productivity in the US soared by 80.9%, while hourly pay grew by just 29.4% during the same period.
It's likely due to the internet, I would think. 1980, 1990 is when most people had availability to the internet.
The paychecks of typical workers have not grown nearly as fast as overall economic growth over the past 40 years.
In June 2024, two-thirds of middle-income households believed that their income was falling behind the cost of living.
Of course. I mean, like the standard raise for someone is what, 3 to 5%. That's like a CPI based inflation adjusted raise. Like inflation over that time period over the last 3 or 4 years has probably been closer to 20%. Most people have not gotten a 20% raise in the last 3 to 4 years combined.
I think that many Americans feel the financial struggle because their household budget and their household balance sheets are facing so much pressure.
Every time I check my local mom group on Facebook, I see requests or people asking where they can get some financial assistance to pay utilities or assistance with rent. And it's concerning because these people are working full-time jobs and they just can't make things work right now.
The issue of wage trends, wage suppression, it just could not be more central to what has happened to the middle class over the past couple of decades.
So what exactly is keeping the middle class from earning a higher paycheck?
I think people think inflation is a policy problem, but wages are my problem. And it turns out wages are not just your problem. Wages are entirely a policy and political variable.
Yeah, they are. But let's not pretend that inflation is not a political issue as well. I mean, right now, as of this year, I think Congress is in like a $2 trillion deficit, right? We probably have over $32 trillion in national debt at this point. All that stuff is long-term contributors to inflation, right? We have a spending problem.
The main goal of policymakers at the Federal Reserve is to ensure maximum employment while keeping prices stable.
Keep maximum employment while keeping prices stable. I mean, the Federal Reserve's job is to make sure that prices are stable, but when they say ensure maximum employment, what they're basically saying is that we will lay off people if we have to in order to keep prices low.
They rely on various economic data to guide their decisions, including the natural rate of unemployment.
Economists produce this thing they call the natural rate of unemployment. It's like the lowest unemployment can go without generating inflation.
Throughout
So is that the 2% number?
history, the natural rate of unemployment has hovered between 4.5% and 5.5%.
5% unemployment? That doesn't sound right.
Then we look at actual unemployment and how often it is above that estimate of the natural rate versus below. And if you look at the years since 1979, we have spent far more time.
That big jump is, well, everybody knows what that big jump was. That was 2020. Great year.
With actual unemployment well above that estimate of the natural rate.
Between 1949 and 1979, the actual unemployment rate was cumulatively 15.3% below the natural rate of unemployment. In contrast, the unemployment rate was cumulatively 35.7% above the natural rate of unemployment between 1979 and 2017. This has real-world consequences for the American middle class, because wages tend to grow faster during periods when unemployment is low.
Wages tend to go fast when unemployment is low. Well, the reason for that is because if unemployment is low, then that means that there's a shortage of new people to move from job to job. And that means that the labor market is tighter. And when the labor market is tighter, employees can bargain for better wages.
The Economic Policy Institute estimates that just a 1 percentage point drop in unemployment leads to wage growth of 0.4 to 0.9 percentage points for workers near the median of the wage distribution.
The best bargaining chip any employee has to getting wage growth is going to the boss and saying, I'm going to go somewhere else unless I make more money. And that's just not a credible.
That only, like he was saying, it's not a credible threat. It only works if they can't immediately replace you with someone else.
Threat when unemployment is high. The only people whose wages are not very affected by unemployment are like the 90th and 95th percentile. Like they don't need super low unemployment to get some consistent wage growth, but the middle class absolutely does.
because there's not many people who know those who can do those jobs. So they don't need a tight labor market in order to negotiate for better wages, is what he's saying.
This means the Federal Reserve's policy decisions that result in higher than necessary unemployment might be creating conditions that actively hold back wage growth for middle-class Americans. Location could be another factor.
There are other reasons for why we've seen less growth in the middle than, say, at the other parts of the distribution. Another one is just that people don't move as much as they used to.
The share of Americans on the move has declined over the years, from more than 20% in 1948 to just 8.7% in 2022.
How do you define a mover? Somebody that's moved in the last couple of years, someone that's moved X number of miles away from where they live? How do you define a mover? I'm curious.
Between 1986 and 1997, almost 29% of job seekers relocated for new jobs. That number has fallen to just 1.6% in 2023. Location plays a crucial role in wages. Despite the surge in remote work during the COVID-19 pandemic, wages for remote and hybrid jobs haven't grown nearly as much as salaries for full-time in-office roles, with some research estimating that remote workers could earn up to 30% more if they came into the office 5 days a week.
But people don't really want to do that. Anybody that has the flexibility to work from home at least a couple of days a week, they appreciate that flexibility, right? If they have kids, they have other commitments, they got deliveries coming. Like, you could never know what people got going on. So I don't know. That's a thing that most CEOs say that they really want now is they want people to come back into the office. Makes sense for them because they're trying to justify the cost of having all of those buildings that they're already renting. But it doesn't really make sense from an employee perspective if you have that kind of leverage. And that's why we still have, at least for some sectors of the economy, some hybrid between work from home and being in the office.
Decades ago, when I was a worker living in sort of a lower opportunity area, I would move to a higher productivity city, like maybe San Francisco or New York City or Los Angeles. And as a result, I'd be able to capture higher wages, gain more skills, and then move up the income distribution. Now there's a lot less people moving across areas to capture those opportunities.
But they're not saying why. Is it because people don't want to move? Is it because they can't afford to? Moving has its own costs, right? Like when you decide to move to a new city, like that's an investment in whatever place you're going to. You have to have the ability to do that, right? If you're already stretched thin, you're not going to be able to move.
Real reason behind that is astronomical housing costs that are due to excessive regulations at local levels.
Home prices hit a record high in June 2024.
So what he's saying is some places like California have zoning laws where you can't build certain types of housing or you can't build certain amounts of housing. And so that decreases the housing supply. And so that will increase prices, right? If you don't have any rent controls or anything like that.
With existing homes selling at a median price of $426,900. In line with typical seasonal trends, home prices declined in July and August, but still set new records for those months.
The overwhelming number of jobs in the U.S. are in places that have really not seen much construction of housing.
Some economists also argue that globalization has played a pivotal role in stalling wage growth for middle-income Americans.
If you have companies that are multinational conglomerates and are willing to ship entire business sectors of their companies across the ocean so that they can pay those workers lower wages, then that means less jobs for people who work and live here in the United States.
The expansion of trade with countries that have much lower wages, I think that was always going to provide quite a bit of pressure on the U.S. middle class because so
Slide a bit.
much of that trade runs through like the manufacturing sector, which is where a lot of middle class jobs have been.
Between 1995 and 2013, trade with lower wage nations like Mexico and China reduced wages for workers without a 4-year degree by roughly 5.6%, or about
There you go. I'm assuming that's inflation adjusted.
$2,000 per year for workers at the median wage. However, whether globalization is actually to blame has long been debated, with some research suggesting it has had a minimal impact on wage and income inequality.
I don't believe that.
It's not just that we did it, we also did it on terms set by trade agreements that really, people call them free trade agreements. They weren't. They were basically exercises in selective protectionism. Who gets
I think he's talking about the North Atlantic Trade Agreement. I think it's called NAFTA.
protected, who doesn't? Middle class workers were not protected. Corporations, especially corporations like software companies, drug makers, Hollywood, were all protected in these trade agreements. So it's not just the natural flow of globalization, it's how policy shaped how it happened and who got protected and who didn't.
Regulatory policies can limit the power workers have within the labor market.
We've seen this huge decline in the share of workers who are represented by a union in the US economy.
In 1983, roughly 1 in 5 Americans were in a union. By 2023, that number had dropped to 1 in 10. Full-time salaried union workers made about 15.9% more compared to non-union workers in 2023.
Yeah, there's been a lot of strikes this year. Um, I know Boeing is currently going through a strike now for increased wages. And then if you've seen that in the news, like this week that just passed or the week before that, a lot of the port workers went on strike for the same reason. They actually got a pay raise. I think it was like significant too. It was like 60%. That makes you wonder like how underpaid were they? But like unions as a general concept, like I support that idea because if the labor market is not super tight, like people may not have the ability to do to advocate for better wages. So unionizing essentially allows for collective bargaining to take place, right? Like if you have the certain skills in a workforce and there's enough of you that all agree that you're being underpaid, you should be able to negotiate with your boss. I don't really see a problem with that. There are some drawbacks to unions. That's not the point of the video, but overall, I think that they're a good concept, and I don't really believe in the whole concept of these large multinational conglomerates union busting for this reason.
Single worker going to the boss and saying you need to give me a raise or I'll leave, that's not, there's not a lot of force behind that threat. When you've got a union doing it, there's a lot of force behind that threat. And you look at countries that look like us, so they've experienced the same globalization shocks, like the UK, Canada, Germany. Their unionization rates have fallen a bit since the peaks, but nowhere like the US fall. And then if you just sort of look at the facts on the ground over the past 30 to 40 years in the US, there's just clearly been a growing employer hostility to union organizing efforts.
Amazon has been doing a lot of union busting lately. I know of, so in New York especially. Also Starbucks. I know they did at one point. I don't know what their union state is now.
Among U.S. employers involved in unionization efforts,
There you go, Amazon. I just said that. I haven't seen this video, by the way.
more than 4 out of 10 have been charged with violating federal laws during their union election campaigns. And 1 out of 5 campaigns involved the charge that a worker was illegally fired for trying to organize a union.
Just the number of registered unfair labor practices that are firing people trying to organize a union have risen a lot. And one thing,
And some of that is state specific. In some states, you can't form a union like that.
that's happened to enable that is, I mean, one, there's been a change in management norms, I think, but also like all of the penalties for doing that, just like they're not adjusted for inflation often. They've always been pathetically low. Like if you fire a worker for trying to organize a union, the penalty you face is you have to pay them back wages after the whole legal process grinds out and they come back to your company. But then you're allowed to deduct any wages they made in the meantime at another job they got. And so firing workers trying to form a union is just a pretty small cost of business. And it pays off great because unions really do raise wages, and that's not something employers want.
The decline of union membership isn't the only roadblock for growing the middle-class workers' income.
So in many cases, you'll have policies at a local level and a firm-specific level that cut off wage growth.
There's occupational licensing in different areas of the country, which can make it harder to start a new career.
I've never heard of that. Occupational licensing? Are they saying that you have to get permission to have jobs in certain sectors?
While estimates vary, between a fifth and a third of all American workers are required to have a license to work. A study found that jobs in states requiring
Teachers, engineers, project engineers or professional engineers, they need licenses.
a license earn about 8% more compared to the same jobs in states that don't.
Kinda should. It's harder to get that job.
However, just a 10% increase in licensed workers with similar skills is estimated to reduce all workers' wages down by 1.6 to 2.3%.
How?
Economists estimate that eliminating occupational licensing can reduce earnings inequality within occupations by 2 to 4%. While licensing might appear to be necessary for some professions with health and safety concerns,
Yeah.
researchers
I completely forgot about doctors.
found no statistical difference in health and safety quality outcomes between states that require licensing compared to states that don't.
To be a hairstylist in some places, for instance, you need a license from the state to actually do that. So there's a lot of these types of occupations that really are not dangerous and don't need state licensing to be made safe. But nonetheless, we have these licenses in place probably to protect the incumbents and make it harder for new entrants to come in, sort of do their own business or start this new career field and thereby increase their wages.
I think as important as the middle class is economically, and I think it's incredibly important, it is just the entire game for, I think, politics.
Both political parties in the United States recognize the economic pressures facing U.S. families. There's different visions on how to intervene effectively.
I was raised as a middle class kid, and I am actually the only person on this stage who has a plan that is about lifting up the middle class and working people of America.
For Kamala Harris, strengthening wages is about two things. It's about boosting the industries where wage workers work. So she wants to build on the Biden administration's infrastructure investments to onshore domestic manufacturing and construction and boost those domestic industries. She also has a huge focus on strengthening union protections.
You better thank unions.
She wants to raise the minimum wage, end taxes on tips, which is a policy that Trump first proposed and
No taxes on tips. I live in Arizona. Nevada's right across the way. A lot of entertainment economy. I work in food service as well. I support no taxes on tips. If both of them support that, I support that. That doesn't sound like a bad idea.
She later echoed Trump's proposals to strengthen wages for the middle class. In many ways, it mirrors what Harris has proposed, which is to onshore domestic manufacturing and construction. He has proposed doing so by instating a hardline tariff policy.
Bring jobs back. So this whole thing about a tariff, I'm not a macroeconomics expert by any means, but a tariff is essentially a tax on imported goods. So if you have a good that is imported into the country and you have a comparable good that is also manufactured at home, the tariff essentially will increase the cost of that good as it's being imported. Not directly, indirectly. So if you charge a company a tariff that's importing a good, then the way that they pay for the tariff is by charging a higher price to import the good, right? They'll just increase the price that they pay, that the consumers have to pay for the good. And so when you compare a product made in the USA with one that is not, if the tariff is high enough, then the product with the tariff will cost more, even if it was cheaper to manufacture because the people who manufactured it were paid a lower wage to manufacture. So this is a way to try to, in my mind, in my understanding of how these things work, is a way to make pricing more competitive for products that are made here in the United States.
Former President Trump publicly denounced globalism during his time in office, blaming the financial struggles faced by many Americans on it.
We're doing tariffs on other countries. Other countries are going to finally, after 75 years, pay us back for all that we've done for the world.
He's faced some backlash from economists about how this could threaten to reheat the consumer price spikes that are just beginning to cool, but he sees it as a long-term strategy to bring domestic jobs back to the US, boost.
It could potentially, right? Because the U.S. doesn't make a lot of its own goods. Like we saw this during, during the whole pandemic season, right? Is that we didn't have any gloves, we didn't have any smocks, like we didn't make ventilators, we didn't make any of that stuff. So we had to import that stuff. So if you impose a tariff on something that there's no alternative made for in the United States, then it'll just be a higher cost. I mean, that's my understanding of how things work. There may be, macroeconomics is complicated. There could be other impacts on that as well. But also to the point in the video, right, if it's a long-term move, then it may increase prices in the short term, but in the long term, you bring all the manufacturing back to the United States, and that could produce a net benefit. It could.
Manufacturing in the US. So in some ways, this is his plan to grow the US economy as a whole and let the effects sort of ripple into the middle class as a result.
Another major difference is in the candidate's proposed tax policies.
I have a plan to give startup businesses $50,000 tax deduction to pursue their ambitions, their innovation, their ideas, their hard work. I have a plan, $6,000 for young families for the first year of your child's life.
Maybe it doesn't go far enough, perhaps. $6,000. Ask anybody that has a kid. Drop in the bucket.
help you in that most critical stage of your child's development.
She has proposed offsetting the costs of her tax relief proposals by increasing corporate tax hikes and tax hikes on the wealthy. She's proposed increasing the corporate tax rate to 28%. She wants to increase the tax rate on long-term capital gains also to 28%.
28%, the highest that you can pay on long-term capital gains rates right now, by the way, is 20%. So most people who earn a living with wages or salaries, they pay way more than that. They pay way more than 28% of their wages in taxes. So it will really just be bringing it in alignment with what most people pay who make most of their money through salaries and wages rather than capital gains and investment income.
Every
Now, whether or not you want to use that as now whether or not the federal government wants to use that as a tax incentive and that's why it's lower, I mean, we could debate that.
Everybody knows I'm an open book. Everybody knows what I'm going to do. Cut taxes very substantially and create a great economy like I did before.
So in 2017, we had the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which substantially lowered the corporate tax. And there's varying degrees about how much people believe that translated into higher wages, but there's a pretty strong consensus that lowering the corporate tax actually increased worker wages.
Some research has estimated that the 2017 tax cut led to a $750 increase in annual pay for full-time employees.
Oh wow, $750. Then they took it right back with the inflation.
In 2017 dollars. Opposing research argues that the earning gains were concentrated in the top 10%, with no changes in earnings for the bottom 90%.
Trump's framing of boosting the middle class by boosting the economy as a whole doesn't offer sort of the targeted approach that Harris has brought to her economic platform. Her policy page is consistently drawing back to the middle class, saying how, her tax relief programs will benefit the middle class specifically. Trump is focused on growth and growing the US economy as a whole and letting the success of that policy trickle down to the middle class.
I don't know if that's a thing. Trickle down economics. Like I said, I'm not a macroeconomics expert.
Policy matters so much in generating like the wage income that is the lifeblood of the middle class. I think a lot of people just haven't made that connection between the wages I earn and what is the policy environment. When they think policy, they think direct benefits that come from the government, but a lot of what the government does conditions how fast their wages grow in the labor market. And yet the connection hasn't been made on how policy affects them in the most important way they earn income. And
what's interesting is that the Federal Reserve controls monetary policy, but the individuals at the Federal Reserve are not democratically elected like Congress is. So how are those people held accountable?
In the labor market,
I'm not hopeful that the presidential platforms themselves will solve the woes of the middle class, but nor do I think the federal government is in the front seat on solving them anyway. But they are taking it seriously. I mean, hopefully those problems will be made more transparent, will shine a light on them, and then through a combination of federal action, state and local action, that we will see some of these improvements that we need in terms of less regulation and some targeted support where it makes sense to help middle class families thrive.
Okay, and that's the video. Yeah, I think the video was pretty good. They covered a lot of ground as far as political policy, and then also some things that are under the control of individuals as far as deciding to move or change careers and stuff like that. So they covered a broad swath of topics, which I think is really good. Ultimately, though, most people, as a general idea, have not had enough wage increases to cover the costs of inflation. I think that's just a reality of it. And certainly vote in your local elections and things. Those things matter a lot. I appreciate you watching. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that content, feel free to explore other content that we offer by either clicking here or here. See you in the next video.